"Take the pretty one," her father offered the Duke, but he looked at the rejected sister in the shadows. The Duke was supposed to marry her sister. Instead, he turned his gaze to her, the rejected one standing in the shadows. What did he see in the invisible sister that everyone else missed? Hello, lovely. If you're enjoying this historic romantic tale, I'd be so grateful for a like or a subscribe. It helps me bring you more stories of love, longing, and history. And if you're up for it, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every note, and it always brings a smile to my face. Chapter 1. The Invisible Daughter. The afternoon light slanted through the library windows in pale golden streams, illuminating dancing motes of dust that drifted like tiny spirits through the still air. Lady Eleanor Harrington sat curled in the worn leather chair by the eastern window, her favorite perch in all of Harrington Hall, with John Locke, an essay concerning human understanding, open in her lap. The pages were soft beneath her fingers, edges rounded from years of handling. The leather binding cracked but comfortable in her hands, like an old friend's embrace. She had just reached Locke's assertion that the mind was a blank slate tabula rasa, upon which experience wrote its lessons when the sound of carriage wheels on gravel shattered the library's peaceful silence. She's returned. Lady Sophia has returned. The housemaid's excited cry echoed through the hall's stone corridors, followed by the rapid patter of feet. Eleanor looked up from her book, marking her place with a finger, and listened as the household stirred to life with an energy it rarely possessed these days. Doors opened and closed. Voices rose in cheerful greeting. Even Mrs. Wilkins, their aging housekeeper, could be heard hurrying down the main staircase with uncharacteristic speed. Eleanor remained in her chair, watching the dust motes continue their lazy dance, undisturbed by the commotion beyond the library doors. Her sister had been to the modiste in London, a 2-day journey that had consumed the household's conversation for the past week. New gowns for the season, the finest silks, colors that would complement Sophia's golden hair and rose-petal complexion. Eleanor had heard it all discussed in exhaustive detail, though no one had thought to ask if she might need new gowns as well. Not that it mattered. Eleanor had long ago accepted her role in the family tableau, the shadow to Sophia's light, the footnote to her sister's story. She returned her attention to Locke, but the words blurred before her eyes. Through the library's half-open door, she could hear her sister's voice, bright and musical, like bells chiming. "Oh, Mrs. Wilkins, you should see the emerald silk. The modiste said it would make my eyes look like precious gems, and the cream muslin with the embroidered roses. Father will adore it." "I'm certain. I'm sure you'll be the belle of every ball, my lady," Mrs. Wilkins replied, her voice warm with genuine affection. Eleanor closed her book quietly and rose from her chair, moving to the window that overlooked the hall's front courtyard. Below, servants were unloading trunk after trunk from the carriage, each presumably filled with finery that would make Sophia even more dazzling than nature had already rendered her. Lady Sophia Harrington stood in the center of the activity like a sun around which planets orbited, her golden hair catching the autumn light, her face animated with excitement. She was beautiful. There was no denying it. Society had proclaimed it since her debut 3 years ago, and the proclamation had only grown louder with time. Perfect features, perfect bearing, perfect charm. Eleanor turned away from the window and caught her own reflection in the small mirror that hung beside the bookshelf. Dark hair pulled back simply, gray eyes that were too large for her face, features that were pleasant enough, but utterly unremarkable. She was not ugly, precisely, but she was not Sophia, and in the world they inhabited, that single fact defined everything. The library door burst open, and Sophia swept in, still wearing her traveling cloak, her cheeks flushed from the journey. Eleanor, there you are. I should have known I'd find you buried in books. Her tone was affectionate, without malice, which somehow made it worse. Welcome home, Eleanor said, managing a genuine smile. Whatever complicated feelings she harbored about her sister, she did love her. It was impossible not to love Sophia, who had never been cruel, never been unkind, but who simply existed in a different sphere entirely. You must come see the gowns, Sophia insisted, crossing to take Eleanor's hands. The modiste has outdone herself this time. There's a blue one that I think would suit you wonderfully. I had her make it up in your size. It will need altering, of course. But that was thoughtful, Eleanor interrupted gently, squeezing her sister's hands. Thank you. Sophia's expression flickered with something guilt, perhaps, or pity, but it passed quickly, replaced by her usual bright enthusiasm. Come then, I want your opinion on how I should wear my hair for the season's first balls. Eleanor followed her sister from the library, leaving Locke behind on the chair. The hall's corridors, which had seemed so peaceful moments ago, now thrummed with energy centered entirely on Sophia's return. They passed two maids carrying hat boxes, both of whom curtsied to Sophia and looked straight through Eleanor, as though she were merely part of the wallpaper. She was used to it. The late afternoon found Eleanor in the small parlor adjacent to her father's study, ostensibly reading, but actually seeking the quiet warmth of the fire. The early autumn chill had crept into the hall's bones, and funds for extra coal were scarce, though no one spoke of such things openly. The sound of raised voices filtered through the study door. 6 months, my lord, perhaps less, if your creditors grow impatient. Eleanor recognized Mr. Thornton's voice, the family solicitor, whose visits had become increasingly frequent and increasingly grim over the past year. There must be something, her father replied, his usually authoritative voice tight with desperation. The estate. Surely the estate is mortgaged to the hilt. My lord, you've borrowed against every acre, every asset. Unless you find a substantial infusion of capital, you will lose everything. The title will remain, but the hall, the lands, the income, all of it will be forfeit. A heavy silence followed. Eleanor sat frozen in her chair, the book forgotten in her lap, her heart pounding. Then Sophia must marry well, Lord Harrington said finally, his voice hard with resolve. And quickly, Duke William Beaumont is seeking a wife, they say. He's been in mourning these 8 years, but rumor has it he's finally ready to marry. Sophia could be the answer to everything. His Grace is notoriously particular, Mr. Thornton cautioned. Many have tried to capture his attention. Sophia will succeed where others have failed. She must. Our entire future depends on it. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she gripped her book. 6 months, complete ruin, and Sophia, beautiful, charming Sophia, was to be the sacrifice that saved them all. The study door opened abruptly. Eleanor barely had time to look down at her book, feigning absorption as her father strode past the parlor entrance without so much as a glance in her direction. His face was set in hard lines, his mind clearly racing through calculations and schemes. He passed within 3 ft of where she sat and did not see her. Eleanor exhaled slowly, the familiar ache of invisibility settling in her chest like a stone. Evening brought a return to the hall's usual rhythms. Dinner was a quiet affair. The family dining room felt too large for 3 people. The empty chairs a reminder of better times when aunts and uncles and cousins had filled the house with noise and laughter. Lord Harrington was distracted, speaking little, his gaze constantly drifting to Sophia as though seeing her anew, calculating her worth in the marriage market. Sophia chatted about London, the modiste, the ladies she'd encountered shopping. Her voice had that slightly performative quality it always carried at dinner, as though she were practicing for some larger stage. Eleanor ate quietly, contributed little to the conversation, and was not missed when she excused herself before dessert. She found her way back to the library, to her chair by the window, now dark with night. Someone had lit a single candle on the side table, probably Mrs. Wilkins, who alone seemed to notice Eleanor's habits and needs. She opened Locke again, but could not focus on the philosophy. Her mind kept returning to the overheard conversation, to her father's desperate words, to the impossible weight now resting on Sophia's slender shoulders. Sophia must marry well. Not Eleanor. Never Eleanor. The thought had never even crossed Lord Harrington's mind that his younger daughter might be of use in solving the family's crisis. She was simply too inconsequential, too easily forgotten. Eleanor had spent 22 years as a shadow in her own home, drifting through rooms without causing a ripple, existing in the margins of her family story. She loved them. She loved her father despite his blindness, loved Sophia despite the complicated tangle of affection and envy that bound them together. But the loneliness of perpetual invisibility had carved a hollow space inside her that no amount of books could fill. The sound of hoofbeats on gravel drew her attention to the window. A messenger on horseback, riding fast despite the darkness. She watched as he dismounted at the entrance, watched as a footman took an envelope from him. Moments later, Sophia's delighted cry echoed through the hall. "Father, father, come quickly. An invitation." From Duke William Beaumont himself. Eleanor remained in her library chair, listening to the excited voices in the distance, knowing without being told that her name would be included on the invitation, only as an afterthought, a necessary formality. Lady Sophia Harrington and family were invited to a grand ball at the Duke's estate. The trap was set. The game had begun, and Eleanor, as always, would watch from the shadows while her sister stepped into the light. She looked down at the book in her lap, at Locke's careful reasoning about the nature of human understanding, and felt the weight of a truth the philosopher had never addressed. That understanding oneself, seeing one's own worth, meant nothing if the world had already decided you were invisible. The candle flickered in a draught, casting dancing shadows across the page. Outside her library sanctuary, Harrington Hall hummed with new energy, new hope. All of it centered on Sophia's golden beauty and the Duke who might save them all. And Eleanor, alone with her books and her thoughts, allowed herself one moment of selfish longing, wondering what it might feel like to be seen, truly seen, by someone who looked past the surface to the person beneath. Then she closed her book, extinguished her candle, and disappeared into the darkness of the hall's corridors. A ghost in her own home. Chapter 2. The arrangement. The week that followed the Duke's invitation transformed Harrington Hall into a hive of frenzied activity. Seamstresses arrived at dawn and worked by candlelight into the evening, their needles flashing as they adjusted hems and took in seams, the scent of lavender sachets mixed with the sharper smell of new fabric. And everywhere Eleanor turned, she encountered bolts of silk, scattered pins, and harried servants rushing from room to room. All of it centered on Sophia. The morning room had been converted into a fitting chamber, where Sophia stood on a raised platform like a statue being sculpted. Turning this way and that, as Madame Laurent, the modiste, fussed over the drape of emerald silk. "The neckline must be perfect, my lady," Madame Laurent muttered through a mouthful of pins. "His Grace will notice every detail." Eleanor watched from the doorway, unnoticed as usual, as her sister stood perfectly still, her arms extended while two assistants adjusted the sleeves. Sophia's face was serene, almost blank, the expression she wore when she retreated into herself, becoming the beautiful object everyone required her to be. Lady Eleanor. Eleanor turned to find Madame Laurent's youngest assistant, a girl barely 16, holding a dress of pale gray muslin. "For you, my lady, for the fitting." The dress was simple, almost severe in its lack of ornamentation. Eleanor recognized it as the afterthought. It was made up quickly from leftover fabric, designed to ensure she would blend seamlessly into the wallpaper of whatever ballroom she occupied. The fitting took less than 10 minutes. No one fussed over the drape of her hem or worried whether the neckline flattered her complexion. The assistant marked a few adjustments with chalk, nodded, and moved on to more important tasks. Eleanor caught her reflection in the standing mirror as she changed back into her day dress. In the gray gown, she looked like a ghost, pale, insubstantial, easily overlooked, which was, she supposed, exactly the point. Lord Harrington had converted his study into a training ground of sorts. Eleanor passed by one afternoon to find him coaching Sophia on the art of conversation, pacing before her like a general preparing his troops for battle. You must be charming, but not forward, interested but not desperate. You must laugh at his jests, but not too loudly. You must, Father, please. Sophia interrupted, a rare edge to her voice. I understand what is required. Do you? Lord Harrington stopped his pacing, fixing his elder daughter with an intense stare. Do you truly understand what hangs in the balance? You are the solution to all our problems, my dear. The Duke is our salvation. You cannot, you must not fail us. Eleanor, standing unnoticed in the doorway, watched her sister's shoulders tighten, watched the way Sophia's hands clenched in her lap before she forced them to relax, to settle gracefully, perfectly. I will not fail you, Father, Sophia said quietly, her voice stripped of its usual music. Lord Harrington nodded, satisfied, and returned to his pacing, listing all the ways Sophia must present herself to capture a duke's attention. Eleanor slipped away before either of them noticed her presence. The weight of expectations settling over Sophia was almost visible, like dust accumulating on a shelf, layer upon layer until the original surface disappeared beneath it. That night, Eleanor was reading by candlelight in her chamber when a soft knock sounded at her door. Come in, she called, surprised. No one knocked at her door after dark. Sophia entered, still in her dressing gown, her golden hair loose around her shoulders. In the flickering candlelight, she looked younger, less polished, almost fragile. I couldn't sleep, Sophia said, hovering near the door, as though uncertain of her welcome. Eleanor set aside her book and gestured to the chair beside her bed. Sit with me. Sophia crossed the room and sank into the chair, drawing her knees up beneath her like a child seeking comfort. For a long moment, neither sister spoke. Do you ever feel like a thing rather than a person? Sophia asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor's breath caught. It was the most honest question her sister had ever asked her. Yes, Eleanor answered simply. Every day, Sophia looked at her then, really looked at her, and Eleanor saw something raw and desperate in her sister's eyes. But before Eleanor could reach out, before she could offer comfort or solidarity, Sophia's expression shuddered. The mask slipped back into place. Beautiful, serene, untouchable. I should let you sleep, Sophia said, rising abruptly. The week ahead will be exhausting. She was gone before Eleanor could find words to call her back, leaving only the faint scent of rose water and the echo of a vulnerability too frightening to examine. Eleanor stared at the closed door for a long time before returning to her book, though the words swam meaninglessly before her eyes. The library became Eleanor's refuge from the chaos consuming the hall. While seamstresses sewed and dancing masters taught Sophia the latest steps, Eleanor buried herself in research. She told herself she was simply curious, but truthfully she was starving for any scrap of information about the man who had become the center of their household's desperate hopes, Duke William Beaumont. The name appeared in various books and periodicals scattered throughout her father's collection. She pieced together a portrait from fragments. Born in 1785, inherited the dukedom at 23 when his father died suddenly. By all accounts, a serious young man, scholarly with progressive views that occasionally raised eyebrows among the more conservative members of the peerage. And then the tragedy that had defined him. 8 years ago, the woman he loved, Lady Victoria Langley, had died in a riding accident. The Duke had retreated from society, becoming something of a recluse, managing his estates with capable efficiency, but attending no balls, hosting no parties, living in what the gossip columns called splendid isolation. Until now, until he had decided finally to seek a wife. Eleanor found a political pamphlet tucked between 2 books on agricultural reform. She almost missed it, but the Duke's name on the cover caught her eye. On the Necessity of Educational Reform by William Beaumont, Duke of Ravenswood. She opened it carefully and began to read. The arguments were cogent, passionate, radical. The Duke advocated for broader access to education, including, and Eleanor's pulse quickened as she read Classical Education for Women. He quoted Mary Wollstonecraft. He argued that denying half the population access to learning was not only unjust, but economically foolish. A mind is not determined by the body that houses it. He wrote, "To assume women incapable of serious thought is to arm our society with willful ignorance." Eleanor read the pamphlet 3 times, committing whole passages to memory. Here was a man who believed women could think, could reason, could contribute to intellectual discourse, a man who saw minds rather than merely faces. She pressed the pamphlet to her chest and allowed herself a dangerous moment of longing. What would it be like to converse with such a man, to discuss philosophy, politics, ideas that mattered, to be seen not as an ornament or a disappointment, but as a thinking person worthy of engagement? The fantasy was foolish. She knew the Duke would see what everyone else saw. Beautiful Sophia, the obvious choice, the perfect Duchess. And Eleanor would remain invisible as always. She returned the pamphlet to its shelf and extinguished her candle, but sleep was long in coming. The day before the ball, Eleanor found her father in the corridor outside his study. She had a question about which wrap would be appropriate for evening, a small thing hardly worth mentioning, but she had no one else to ask. "Father, might I?" "Not now, Eleanor." Lord Harrington waved her off without looking at her, his attention focused on the letter in his hand. Then, as though remembering something, he glanced up. "Actually, yes. Tomorrow evening, I need you to stay out of the way. This is Sophia's night. The Duke must see her clearly, without distraction. I need you to be invisible." The words were spoken casually, without malice or particular emphasis. He had already turned away before they finished leaving his mouth, disappearing into his study and closing the door. Eleanor stood frozen in the corridor, her father's words echoing in her mind. "I need you to be invisible." It was nothing she hadn't heard before in 1,000 small ways. But the casual cruelty of it, the unthinking dismissal cut deeper than it should have. She pressed her palm against the wall to steady herself, willing away the sting of tears. She was already invisible. Had been her entire life. Her father was merely acknowledging what everyone already knew. The evening before the ball, Eleanor helped Sophia prepare for bed, brushing out her sister's golden hair in long, practiced strokes. Sophia sat before her vanity mirror, watching their reflections, one radiant, one ordinary. The contrast between them impossible to ignore. "You're quiet tonight," Sophia observed. "Tired," Eleanor lied. The candlelight caught in Sophia's hair, turning each strand to spun gold. She was breathtaking, Eleanor thought. Any man would be fortunate to win her. The Duke would take one look at this vision of beauty, and the matter would be settled. "Will you help me dress tomorrow?" Sophia asked. "I find I'm rather nervous." "Of course," Eleanor said, managing a smile. "You'll be magnificent. The Duke won't be able to look away." Sophia's reflection smiled, but her eyes remained troubled. "And what if that's all he sees? The surface? What if there's nothing beneath it that interests him? Eleanor paused mid-stroke, surprised by the question. But before she could formulate an answer, Sophia shook her head, banishing the moment of vulnerability. Never mind foolish thoughts before a ball. Help me with these pins. Eleanor helped her sister prepare for bed, sorted her jewelry for the following evening, and wished her pleasant dreams. As she left Sophia's chamber and returned to her own, she carried with her a tangle of emotions too complex to name love and envy, hope and resignation, compassion, and the dull ache of knowing that tomorrow night she would watch from the shadows while her sister stepped into the light that might save them all. In her own chamber, she lay awake long into the night, thinking of a duke who believed women's minds mattered, and wondering if such a man truly existed outside the pages of political pamphlets. Tomorrow she would find out. Tomorrow she would be invisible as requested. And somewhere in the darkest hours before dawn, Eleanor admitted to herself what she had been trying desperately to deny. That, despite everything, despite logic and experience, and 22 years of evidence to the contrary, a small, foolish part of her heart dared to hope. Chapter 3. The Duke's Gaze. The Duke's estate emerged from the twilight like something from a fairy story, all golden windows and elegant proportions, its classical facade illuminated by hundreds of torches that lined the sweeping drive. Eleanor pressed closer to the carriage window, watching the great house grow larger as they approached, her stomach tight with apprehension. Beside her, Sophia sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her breathing carefully controlled. The emerald silk of her gown shimmered in the dim carriage light, and even in this confined space, she looked like a masterpiece painted by one of the great artists. Lord Harrington, seated across from them, had not stopped talking since they left Harrington Hall. "Remember," Sophia smiled, but not too broadly, "laugh at his conversation. Ask intelligent questions, but do not dominate the discussion." "And Eleanor, I know, Father," Eleanor said quietly. "I'll stay out of the way." He nodded, already dismissing her, his attention returning to Sophia. "This is our moment. Do not waste it." The carriage rolled to a stop. A liveried footman opened the door, and the sounds of the ball flooded in music, laughter, the murmur of society's elite gathering for an evening of careful performance and ruthless judgment. Sophia descended first, her movements graceful, practiced. Lord Harrington followed, then turned to hand Eleanor down as an afterthought. She stepped onto the gravel drive in her pale gray gown and felt herself disappear, becoming merely part of the background against which more important people would shine. The ballroom stole Eleanor's breath despite her determination to remain unmoved. Crystal chandeliers hung from a ceiling painted with elaborate frescoes, their countless candles reflected in gilded mirrors that made the room seem infinite. The orchestra occupied a raised platform at the far end, their music weaving through the conversations of ladies in jewel-toned gowns and gentlemen in impeccable evening dress. The air smelled of hothouse flowers, expensive perfume, and beeswax candles. It was too much, too bright, too loud, too overwhelming. Eleanor felt the urge to flee, warring with curiosity as Lord Harrington guided them through the crowd, accepting greetings from acquaintances, while steering purposefully toward the receiving line. And there, at the center of it all, stood Duke William Beaumont. He was taller than Eleanor had imagined, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that fell slightly over his forehead, despite obvious attempts to tame it. Handsome, certainly, but it was not his features that arrested her attention. It was the quality of stillness about him, the sense of a man who had learned to armor himself against the world. Grief had etched faint lines around his eyes and mouth, lending his face a gravity that set him apart from the younger, more carelessly cheerful men surrounding him. He moved through the obligations of hosting with quiet dignity, greeting each guest with courtesy, but without the affected charm of aristocratic performance. There was something almost weary about him, Eleanor thought, as though he were going through expected motions while his thoughts remained elsewhere. "Your Grace," Lord Harrington's voice rose above the general din as he positioned himself before the Duke, Sophia at his side like a prize being presented. "May I have the honor of presenting my daughter, the finest jewel in all of England, Lady Sophia Harrington." Sophia curtsied perfectly, her golden hair catching the candlelight, her smile luminous. Eleanor, standing slightly behind and to the side, watched the Duke's expression carefully. He bowed, said something appropriate, asked Sophia to dance. Society watched approvingly as the Duke led Sophia to the floor for a waltz. Lord Harrington beamed with satisfaction. Eleanor felt her heart sink with the inevitability of it all. Beautiful Sophia and the handsome Duke. The perfect match, the expected outcome. She slipped away while her father's attention was focused on the dancing couple, moving through the crowd with the ease of someone accustomed to being overlooked. The press of bodies made her anxious, the noise overwhelming, and she found herself gravitating toward the quieter edge of the ballroom. A wall of floor-to-ceiling bookcases occupied one end of the room, a curious choice for a ballroom, but Eleanor blessed whoever had designed it. She approached the shelves like a drowning person, reaching for solid ground. The books were real, not merely decorative. She ran her fingers along the spines, finding comfort in their familiar solidity. Philosophy, political theory, poetry, a collection that spoke of genuine intellectual curiosity rather than mere status. Her hands stopped on a slim volume bound in dark blue leather, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman by Mary Wollstonecraft. Eleanor pulled it from the shelf, her heart quickening. She had read it twice, had memorized whole passages, had found in Wollstonecraft's fierce arguments a validation of thoughts she'd barely dared articulate. To find it here in a Duke's ballroom seemed almost miraculous. She opened it carefully, finding the dedication page, then the beginning of the introduction. The words were old friends welcoming her home. Wollstonecraft, a bold choice for a ball. The voice came from directly beside her, low, cultured, tinged with something that might have been amusement. Eleanor's head snapped up, the book nearly slipping from her hands. The Duke stood not 3 feet away, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "Your Grace, Eleanor stammered, feeling heat flood her cheeks. "I apologize, I shouldn't have." "Why not?" he interrupted gently. "They're here to be read, not merely displayed." She stared at him, confusion warring with embarrassment. The dance had ended. He should be with Sophia with her father, securing the arrangement everyone expected. Instead, he stood before Eleanor in her invisible gray gown, looking at her as though she were actually worth seeing. "Have you read it?" he asked, nodding toward the book. "Yes," Eleanor managed. "What did you think?" The question was genuine, his attention fully focused on her in a way that made her feel exposed and strangely exhilarated. I think Eleanor paused, gathering her thoughts, feeling herself slip into the familiar comfort of ideas rather than awkward social performance. I think she argues persuasively that denying women education does not protect their virtue, but rather ensures their dependence. That treating women as decorative objects rather than thinking beings diminishes both the women themselves and the society that constrains them. The Duke's expression shifted, something lighting in his eyes that hadn't been there during his dance with Sophia. "You disagree with her critics, then, those who claim she advocates for unwomanly behavior?" "Her critics confuse independence with impropriety," Eleanor said, warming to the subject, forgetting her nervousness. "They cannot imagine a woman who thinks and remains virtuous, as though the two qualities were somehow incompatible. But surely virtue grounded in genuine understanding is stronger than virtue maintained through ignorance." For the first time since she'd observed him that evening, the Duke smiled, not the polite expression he'd worn while greeting guests, but something genuine, reaching his eyes and softening the grief-carved lines of his face. Victoria used to carry that very volume, he said quietly. She would quote whole passages at dinner parties, much to the horror of the more conventional guests. Victoria, Lady Victoria Langley, the woman he'd loved and lost. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said softly. "I didn't mean to. Please don't apologize." The Duke's voice was firm, but not unkind. "It's been 8 years since anyone spoke to me about ideas rather than condolences. I find I've missed it." Eleanor looked up at him, truly looked at him, and saw past the title and the tragedy to the person beneath, someone intelligent, weary of superficiality, hungry for genuine connection. "Your pamphlet on educational reform," she said before she could stop herself. "I read it. I thought your arguments about access to classical education were particularly compelling." His eyebrows rose. "You've read my pamphlet?" "I read everything I can find," Eleanor admitted. "My father's library is limited, but I make do." "And what do you think of your Grace?" Lord Harrington's voice cut through the moment like a blade. Eleanor stepped back instinctively as her father materialized beside them, his expression hovering between confusion and alarm. Sophia stood slightly behind him, her perfect composure showing the first hairline cracks of uncertainty. "Forgive me, Your Grace," Lord Harrington said, his smile strained. "My younger daughter has a habit of wandering. I hope she hasn't troubled you. Lady Sophia was just mentioning how much she enjoyed your dance." "Not at all," the Duke said, his tone courteous but distant. The warmth that had animated his face during conversation with Eleanor had shuttered, replaced by the polite mask of aristocratic obligation. Lady Eleanor and I were discussing literature, a refreshing conversation. He turned back to Eleanor, and for a moment their eyes met. Something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, or possibility, or the beginning of understanding. "I hope we might continue our discussion another time, Lady Eleanor," he said quietly. Then he bowed, acknowledged Sophia and Lord Harrington with appropriate courtesy, and moved away to greet other guests, leaving Eleanor standing breathless and confused beside the bookcase. Lord Harrington turned on her the moment the Duke was out of earshot. "What did you say to him?" he hissed. "You were supposed to stay invisible, not I did nothing, Father," Eleanor said, still holding Wollstonecraft's book. "He approached me. Well, see that it doesn't happen again. Sophia is the one he should be noticing." He took Sophia's arm and steered her away, already planning his next approach. Eleanor remained by the bookcases, carefully returning the blue volume to its place on the shelf. Her hands trembled slightly. The Duke's words echoed in her mind. "I hope we might continue our discussion another time." Across the ballroom, she caught sight of him speaking with an elderly couple, performing his duties as host with quiet efficiency. But once, just once, his gaze swept back across the room and found her standing by the books. Their eyes met for a heartbeat. Then he looked away. Eleanor pressed her palm against the bookshelf, steadying herself against the strange electric feeling coursing through her. For the first time in her life, someone had looked at her, truly looked at her, and seen not an invisible shadow, but a person worth knowing. It was terrifying, it was wonderful, and Eleanor had absolutely no idea what to do with it. Chapter 4. The Calling. The morning after the ball, Eleanor woke to the sound of her father's voice echoing through the hall's corridors. "He's calling this afternoon. The Duke himself, Mrs. Wilkins, we must prepare the drawing room immediately. Sophia, you must wear the cream muslin. No, the rose silk. It brings out your complexion." Eleanor lay in bed, listening to the household erupt into joyful chaos, and tried to convince herself that the previous evening had meant nothing. The Duke had been polite, curious perhaps, but the conversation by the bookcase had been a momentary aberration, a brief distraction, before he returned to the serious business of courting Sophia. That was the natural order of things. That was how the world worked. She rose and dressed in a simple morning gown of pale blue, then made her way to the breakfast room where she found Sophia already seated, pushing eggs around her plate without eating. "Congratulations," Eleanor said quietly, taking her seat. "Father seems certain the Duke is coming to declare himself. Arsenios." Sophia looked up, her expression unreadable. "Does he?" Before Eleanor could respond, Lord Harrington swept into the room, already dressed for receiving callers despite the early hour. "Sophia, you must eat something. You look pale, Eleanor." He paused, seeming to notice her for the first time. "Yes, well, you may join us in the drawing room when the Duke arrives. It would be odd if you weren't present." How generous, Eleanor thought, but kept the bitterness from her face. The Duke arrived precisely at 3 corks, as proper calling hours dictated. Eleanor sat in the corner of the drawing room, a book open in her lap that she wasn't reading, while Sophia occupied the place of honor on the sofa nearest the fireplace. Lord Harrington hovered near the door, barely containing his excitement. When the Duke entered, he carried a bouquet of late-season roses, their petals just beginning to fade at the edges. He presented them to Sophia with appropriate courtesy, inquired after her health, commented on the pleasant weather. All perfectly correct, all utterly distant. Then his gaze found Eleanor in her corner. "Lady Eleanor," he said, crossing to where she sat. "What are you reading?" She held up the book, a volume of Voltaire's philosophical essays that she'd discovered in her father's library. "Ambitious reading for an afternoon," the Duke observed, and she could have sworn she saw amusement in his eyes. "I find Voltaire's arguments about tolerance particularly relevant," Eleanor said before she could stop herself, "though I disagree with some of his conclusions about natural philosophy." "Do you?" The Duke settled into the chair beside her corner, his attention entirely focused on her response. "In what way?" And just like that, they were deep in conversation about empiricism and rationalism, about the limits of human reason, about whether true knowledge could exist independent of experience. Across the room, Sophia sat with the roses in her lap, watching. Lord Harrington frowned, uncertain how to redirect the Duke's attention without appearing rude. The visit lasted the appropriate 30 minutes. When the Duke took his leave, he bowed to Sophia, thanked Lord Harrington for his hospitality, and told Eleanor he looked forward to continuing their discussion. The moment his carriage disappeared down the drive, Lord Harrington turned on Sophia. "You must engage him more, ask him questions, show interest in his conversation." "I tried, Father," Sophia said quietly. "He was speaking with Eleanor. Then you must speak louder, be more charming." Eleanor left the room before she could hear more. Her book clutched against her chest, her mind spinning with confusion. The pattern repeated itself over the following 2 weeks. The Duke called every 3 days, always during proper hours, always with appropriate gifts, flowers, a book of poetry, a collection of botanical prints. He was unfailingly courteous to Sophia, attentive to Lord Harrington, and scrupulously proper in all his conduct. But his conversations were always with Eleanor. He asked about her reading. She asked about his work on educational reform. They debated the merits of various philosophers, discussed political theory, argued good-naturedly about whether poetry or prose better captured truth. Time disappeared when they spoke, the rest of the room fading until there was only the exchange of ideas, the thrill of being genuinely understood. Eleanor began to anticipate his visits with a mixture of excitement and dread. Each conversation made the next separation more difficult. Each thoughtful question, each moment of intellectual connection carved deeper into her carefully guarded heart. Sophia grew quieter with each visit, her perfect composure showing cracks like fine porcelain under pressure. She performed her role flawlessly, smiled at the right moments, offered tea with graceful hands, never showed anger or resentment. But Eleanor saw the tightness around her sister's eyes, the way her shoulders tensed when the Duke turned his attention away from her. Lord Harrington remained stubbornly oblivious, attributing the Duke's interest in Eleanor to mere politeness. "He's being kind to your sister because she's here," he told Sophia after the 4th visit. "But you must work harder to capture his real attention, be more vivacious, laugh more. Show him what an excellent duchess you would make." Eleanor wanted to scream at her father's blindness. But what would be the point? He saw what he needed to see, what the world had taught him to value. The 5th visit changed everything. The Duke arrived on a crisp afternoon when the autumn leaves were at their peak, the gardens ablaze with gold and crimson. After the usual pleasantries in the drawing room, he made an unexpected request. "The day is remarkably fine," he said, addressing Lord Harrington. "Might I impose upon your hospitality and request a walk in your gardens? I've heard they're quite beautiful this time of year." Lord Harrington nearly fell over himself, agreeing. "Of course." "Your Grace, Sophia, accompany the Duke." "I was hoping," the Duke interrupted gently, "that both Lady Sophia and Lady Eleanor might join me. I find the conversation flows more easily with a small group. It was an unusual request, but not improper." Lord Harrington hesitated, then nodded. The 3 of them walked out into the garden, Sophia on the Duke's right arm, Eleanor on his left, though she had not taken his offered arm, keeping a proper distance instead. They had barely reached the rose arbor when a maid appeared, breathless. "Lady Sophia, forgive me, but your mother requests your presence. She has need of your opinion on the menu for tomorrow's dinner." It was obviously contrived Lady Harrington had never consulted Sophia about menus in her life. But Sophia, reading the situation with the sharp intelligence she usually kept hidden, simply nodded. "Of course, Your Grace, Lady Eleanor. Please excuse me." She swept away, leaving Eleanor alone with the Duke among the fading roses. Panic fluttered in Eleanor's chest. This was improper. They should return to the house, find a chaperone, maintain the appropriate distance. Instead, they walked deeper into the garden. "Your Grace," Eleanor said finally, unable to bear the silence. "I believe you are expected to court my sister." "Expected?" "Yes." The Duke's voice was quiet, measured. "Expected by your father, by society, by everyone who sees only surfaces." "She is beautiful," Eleanor said, defensive. "She is everything a duchess should be. She is lovely," the Duke agreed. "She is accomplished and graceful and perfectly bred for the role. And when I speak with her, I feel nothing but a distant sort of appreciation, like admiring a portrait in a gallery." Eleanor stopped walking, turning to face him. "Then why do you keep calling?" The Duke met her eyes, and she saw in them a vulnerability that made her breath catch. "I lost someone very dear to me many years ago," he said carefully. "Victoria, she was brilliant and fierce and utterly herself. And when she died, I believed my capacity for connection died with her. I spent 8 years in a comfortable sort of numbness, managing my estates, fulfilling my obligations, feeling nothing." He paused, and Eleanor saw him gathering courage. "But you," he continued, "you remind me that there are still minds worth knowing, souls worth discovering. When we speak, I feel alive again. Not because you resemble Victoria. You don't. Not in any physical way, but because you're real, Eleanor. You're genuinely, authentically yourself, and that is rarer than you can possibly imagine in the world we inhabit." Eleanor's hands trembled. She clasped them together, trying to steady herself. "I am not my sister," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am not beautiful. I am not charming. I am not what society expects. I will embarrass you at dinners and balls. People will say you made a poor choice. That grief has clouded your judgment." "Eleanor," the Duke spoke her name like a prayer. "No, you are something far more rare than beautiful or charming. You are real, and I find I would rather spend my life in honest conversation with someone real than in elegant silence with someone perfect. The garden seemed to hold its breath around them. Fallen leaves crunched softly beneath their feet. The scent of late roses hung in the cooling air. "I don't know what to do with this," Eleanor admitted, tears threatening. "I don't know how to want something this much without being terrified of losing it." "Then be terrified," the Duke said gently. "Be uncertain. Be yourself. That's all I ask." The sound of footsteps on gravel interrupted them. Lord Harrington probably come to ensure propriety, or to redirect the Duke's attention back to Sophia. The Duke stepped back, restoring proper distance. "I should return you to the house." They walked in silence, but everything had changed. Eleanor felt it in the way the air moved around them, in the careful space the Duke maintained between them that somehow felt more intimate than touching. That night, Eleanor stood at her bedroom window, watching the Duke's carriage disappear down the darkened drive. The lamp in his carriage cast a warm glow that faded into the darkness, and she pressed her palm against the cold glass. For 22 years, she had been invisible. For 22 years, she had told herself that invisibility was safety, that not being seen meant not being hurt. But now someone saw her, really saw her, and the terror of being seen warred with a desperate, dangerous hope. What if? The question hung in the darkness like a prayer. What if someone could love me not despite who I am, but because of it? Eleanor rested her forehead against the window and let herself imagine a future she had never dared to dream. Chapter 5. Truths and Fractures. 3 weeks after the ball, Eleanor woke to whispers. She had come downstairs early, seeking the quiet of the morning before the household fully stirred. When voices drifted from the servants' hall, the door left slightly ajar. Imagine the Duke preferring the plain one. The voice belonged to Sarah, one of the newer maids. "My cousin works at the Pendleton estate, and she says all of society is talking about it. Perhaps his grief has addled his wits." Another voice replied, older, more measured. 8 years is a long time to mourn. The mind can play tricks. Still, Lady Sophia must be devastated to be passed over for her own sister. Eleanor's hand tightened on the banister. She should move, should make her presence known, should do anything but stand frozen like a child eavesdropping on adult conversations. The plain one, the words echoed in her mind, reopening every wound she'd thought had scarred over. Of course, that's what they called her. Of course, that's how the world saw her. Not as Eleanor, not as a person with thoughts and feelings, but as the plain one, defined entirely by what she lacked in comparison to Sophia and the Duke's interest, explained away as madness, as grief-induced delusion, not as genuine attraction or intellectual connection, but as something wrong with him. Eleanor turned and climbed the stairs back to her room. Her appetite for breakfast vanished. By afternoon, the whispers had apparently reached her father's ears. Eleanor was in the small parlor attempting to read when Lord Harrington's voice thundered from the doorway. "My study now?" She rose on unsteady legs and followed him, dread settling in her stomach like a stone. He closed the study door behind them with barely controlled force. "What have you done?" His face was flushed, his hands trembling with anger or panic or both. 3 weeks, Eleanor. 3 weeks of the Duke calling, and only now do I understand what's been happening under my own roof. Father, you have been sabotaging your sister's future. He paced before his desk like a caged animal, deliberately engaging him in conversation, displaying your learning like some kind of blue stocking, distracting him from the purpose of his visits. The purpose of his visits? Eleanor's voice rose despite her intention to remain calm. He calls because he wishes to. He speaks with me because he chooses to. I have done nothing but answer his questions honestly. Honestly? Lord Harrington spat the word. You will cease these intellectual displays immediately, When the Duke calls, you will remain silent. You will let Sophia shine as she should. You will remember your place in this family." Something inside Eleanor cracked. 22 years of being overlooked, of being invisible, of never being quite enough. It all came pouring out. My place. She faced her father squarely, tears threatening, but her voice steady. "And what is my place, Father? To sit quietly in corners, to make myself smaller so Sophia can appear larger. I have done nothing but be myself. Perhaps that is the problem. I have never been enough for this family." Lord Harrington stared at her as though seeing a stranger. "You are being hysterical." "I am being honest," Eleanor interrupted. "For the first time in my life, someone sees me. Actually sees me, not as Sophia's shadow, not as the disappointing second daughter, but as myself. And you cannot bear it because it doesn't fit your plans. Our family is facing ruin." Lord Harrington's voice cracked. "Sophia must marry well. She must save us. You have no right to interfere. I have every right to exist," Eleanor shouted, shocking them both. "I have every right to be seen, to be wanted, to matter." The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor turned and fled before her father could respond, before the tears could fall, before she said something that would shatter their relationship beyond repair. She found refuge where she always did, in the library, in the worn leather chair by the window, surrounded by books that had been her companions when people failed her. The tears came then, hot and bitter. She pressed her face into her hands and let herself break. Let the pain of being the plain one, of being told she was sabotaging her sister's happiness simply by being herself, wash over her in waves. She didn't hear the door open, didn't notice she wasn't alone until a handkerchief appeared in her field of vision. "Here," Sophia said softly. Eleanor looked up, startled, to find her sister settling into the chair beside her. Sophia's perfect composure showed cracks. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her hands twisting in her lap. "I heard Father shouting." Sophia said half the house heard him. "I'm sorry," Eleanor managed, wiping her eyes. "I never meant to. Don't." Sophia's voice was firm. "Don't apologize, not for this." They sat in silence for a long moment, the afternoon light slanting through the dusty windows, illuminating the space between them. "I have been jealous of you, Eleanor," Sophia said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor stared at her sister. "Of me? You who have everything," Sophia laughed, but it was a broken sound. "Everything. I have been a thing, Eleanor. A beautiful thing, carefully maintained and displayed, but a thing nonetheless. You have always been free to be yourself, to read what you choose, to think what you wish, to exist without the weight of everyone's expectations crushing you." "Free," Eleanor echoed. "I have been invisible." Yes, Sophia said, meeting her eyes. "But invisible means unseen. I have been seen constantly, but never truly known. Do you understand the difference?" Eleanor saw tears tracking down her sister's perfect face, the first genuine emotion she'd witnessed from Sophia in years. 3 years ago, Sophia continued, her voice shaking, "I fell desperately in love with Captain James Whittaker. He was the second son of a baronet, respectable, but with no title, no fortune. When Father discovered our attachment, he forbade it immediately. James left for India, and she pressed the handkerchief to her eyes. I have been dying slowly ever since. Every ball, every suitor, every performance of being the perfect daughter. It's been a kind of living death." "Sophia," Eleanor breathed, reaching for her sister's hand. "The Duke should choose you," Sophia said fiercely. "You make each other come alive. I see it when you speak together. The way you both lean forward, the way the rest of the room disappears. I see the way he looks at you, Eleanor, and I wish." Her voice broke. "I only wish someone would look at me that way. Not at my face, not at what I represent, but at me. Eleanor squeezed her sister's hand, understanding flooding through her. They had both been trapped, one by beauty, one by its absence, one admired but unknown, one unseen but free to think. I'm terrified, Eleanor confessed. What if I'm not enough? What if this is a fantasy that will shatter the moment he truly knows me? Sophia turned to face her fully, gripping both of Eleanor's hands. What if it's real, and you let fear steal it from you? What if you finally have the chance to be seen and known and loved, and you run from it because you've been taught you don't deserve it? The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. How many years had she told herself she didn't deserve to be seen? How deeply had she internalized the message that she was less than? Received a letter last week, Sophia said, her voice softening. From James. He's returning to England in 2 months. He never married. He says he never stopped loving me. Eleanor's breath caught. What will you do? I don't know yet, Sophia admitted. Father will be furious. But watching you with the Duke, watching you find the courage to be yourself despite everything, it's made me wonder if perhaps I deserve that too. The sisters embraced then, clinging to each other, finding in shared pain and shared hope a connection that had eluded them their entire lives. Sophia's tears soaked into Eleanor's shoulder, and Eleanor's into Sophia's. And for the first time, they were not the beautiful one and the plain one, not rivals for attention or favor, but simply two women trying to find their way in a world that wanted to define them. When they finally pulled apart, Sophia wiped her eyes and managed a watery smile. What will you do? She asked. Eleanor thought of the Duke, of their conversations, of the way he looked at her as though she mattered. She thought of her father's anger, society's judgment, all the voices telling her she wasn't enough. And she made her decision. I will not hide any more, she said, her voice steady despite her fear. And I will be honest with him about everything. The Duke deserves to know the truth about our family's financial situation, about Father's desperation, about all of it. If his interest in me is real, it should survive honesty. Sophia nodded. And if Father tries to stop you, then I will finally stop being invisible by choice, Eleanor said. I have spent 22 years making myself small to fit into spaces that were never meant for me. No more. They sat together as the afternoon light faded. Two sisters who had finally seen each other clearly, finding strength in solidarity. Outside the library, the household continued its anxious preparations. Lord Harrington, no doubt plotting how to salvage Sophia's prospects. But in the quiet sanctuary of books and dusty light, Eleanor and Sophia made their own plans. Plans that had nothing to do with what society expected, and everything to do with what they deserved. For the first time in her life, Eleanor felt the weight of invisibility lifting. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. And she was finally ready. Chapter 6. The Offering and the Debt. The invitation arrived on thick cream paper sealed with the Duke's crest in burgundy wax. Lord Harrington read it 3 times before his hands stopped trembling. The Duke of Ravenswood requests the pleasure of the Harrington family's company for tea at Ravenswood Hall. This is it, he said, his voice tight with barely suppressed hope. A formal invitation to his estate. He means to make an offer. Eleanor, standing by the window with a book she wasn't reading, felt her stomach clench. She had resolved to tell the Duke the truth about their family's circumstances, but the weight of that decision pressed on her chest like a physical thing. Sophia, seated at her embroidery, met Eleanor's eyes across the room. In that glance passed understanding, encouragement, and something that looked like pride. We must make an excellent impression, Lord Harrington continued, already planning. Sophia, the lavender silk. Eleanor, he paused. seeming to truly look at her for the first time in days. "Wear something appropriate." Eleanor nodded, her throat too tight for words. Ravenswood Hall in daylight was even more magnificent than it had been on the night of the ball. The autumn sun gilded the classical facade, and the formal gardens stretched in geometric perfection toward distant woods ablaze with color. They were received in a drawing room that spoke of wealth deployed with taste rather than ostentation. Wedgwood blue walls, furniture upholstered in cream damask, paintings that were genuine masterpieces rather than mere decoration. A tea service of delicate porcelain waited on a low table, and through the tall windows, the gardens beckoned. The Duke greeted them with his characteristic quiet courtesy, but his eyes found Eleanor immediately and held there a moment longer than propriety strictly allowed. "Thank you for accepting my invitation," he said, gesturing for them to be seated. "I hope the journey wasn't too taxing." Lord Harrington launched into effusive gratitude, his nervousness making him verbose. Sophia sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her expression serene. Eleanor perched on the edge of her chair, her heart hammering against her ribs. Tea was poured, pleasantries were exchanged. The Duke asked after their comfort, commented on the unusually fine weather, mentioned an upcoming exhibition at the Royal Academy. All perfectly normal, all utterly surreal. Then the Duke set down his cup and turned to Lord Harrington. "Sir, I wonder if I might request a private word with Lady Eleanor. There is a matter I wish to discuss with her." The silence that followed was deafening. Lord Harrington's cup rattled slightly in its saucer. Sophia's eyes widened fractionally before her composure reasserted itself. "Your Grace, that would be highly irregular," Lord Harrington managed. "I am aware," the Duke said calmly. "Nevertheless, I ask your permission. It wasn't really a request, not from a Duke." Lord Harrington swallowed hard and nodded. The Duke rose and offered Eleanor his hand. She took it, feeling the warmth of his palm through her glove, and followed him from the drawing room. His study was magnificent, a cathedral to learning. Books lined every wall from floor to ceiling, their leather spines gleaming in the autumn light that streamed through windows overlooking the gardens. The scent of leather and paper and old wood filled the air, and Eleanor felt something in her chest loosen despite her anxiety. "Your library," she breathed. "One of the few rooms in this house that feels genuinely mine," the Duke said, closing the door behind them, not completely leaving it slightly ajar for propriety, but enough to create intimacy. They stood facing each other in the center of the room, and Eleanor summoned every ounce of courage she possessed. "Your Grace, there is something you must know," she said before he could speak. "Before you say anything, before this goes any further, I cannot in good conscience allow you to continue in ignorance." He waited, his expression attentive but not alarmed. The words tumbled out in a rush. "My father is facing financial ruin, complete ruin. Our family has approximately 4 months before we lose everything. The estate, the income, all of it. The only thing that will remain is the title, which is worth nothing without the means to support it." She took a shaking breath. "You should know this because if you are considering any future association with our family, you deserve the truth. I will not have you discover later that you were deceived." The Duke's expression didn't change. He simply watched her with those dark, assessing eyes. "I know," he said quietly. Eleanor's world tilted. "You know, I make it my business to know the circumstances of anyone I might ally myself with," the Duke said, taking a step closer. "I learned of your family's situation before I ever attended that ball." "Then why?" Eleanor couldn't finish the question. Her mind spun with implications. The Duke moved closer still, near enough that she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the slight imperfection where an old scar marked his left eyebrow. Because financial circumstances have nothing to do with the worth of a person's mind, heart, or soul, he said, his voice low and intense. I did not come to that ball seeking a transaction, Lady Eleanor. I came because I have been alone for 8 years, and I was weary of loneliness. I came hoping to find. I don't know what I was hoping for, but I found you. Eleanor's hands trembled. She clasped them together to still them. But I will not court you under false pretenses, the Duke continued. I want to help your family, not as payment for your hand, not as leverage or obligation, but because it is within my power to do so, and because your father's desperation has trapped both his daughters in cages they didn't build. I cannot let you solve our problems, Eleanor said, her voice breaking. It wouldn't be right. It would mean I came to you because of money, because of necessity. Then don't let me, the Duke interrupted gently. Let me solve them for Sophia's sake, for your mother's sake, for the servants who would lose their positions. What happens between us should be separate from financial obligation. I want your choice to be free, Eleanor, genuinely free. No one had ever offered her freedom before. The concept was so foreign that she couldn't quite grasp it. Free, she echoed. I am not proposing, the Duke said, and she heard vulnerability in his voice. Not yet. I am asking if you would allow me to court you properly with no debts between us, no obligations, no pressure, just possibility. Just two people discovering whether what we found in conversation might grow into something more. The study was very quiet. Through the windows, Eleanor could see gardeners working in the distance, autumn leaves drifting down like golden rain. The world continued, oblivious to the fact that her entire life was reordering itself in this moment. I am terrified, she whispered. I know, the Duke said. So am I. What if I'm not enough? What if society's judgment proves too much? What if, Eleanor, he spoke her name like a benediction? What if you are exactly enough? What if this terrifying thing is real? She looked up into his face and saw her own fear reflected there, her own desperate hope. And she understood then that vulnerability was not weakness. It was the only honest foundation on which anything real could be built. Yes, she said. I am terrified. But yes, the Duke's expression transformed relief and joy, and something deeper that made her breath catch. He didn't touch her beyond what propriety allowed, but the space between them felt charged, alive with possibility. Then let me speak with your father, he said. Let me settle the debts as a gesture of goodwill. And then, if you're willing, let me court you properly? Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice. They returned to the drawing room where Lord Harrington and Sophia waited in tense silence. The Duke resumed his seat and finished his tea, speaking of inconsequential things before requesting a private word with Lord Harrington in his study. Eleanor watched them go, then met Sophia's questioning gaze. He knows Eleanor mouthed about everything. Sophia's eyes widened, but before she could respond, the men returned. Lord Harrington's face was pale, his expression stunned. We should take our leave, he said, his voice unsteady. Your grace, your generosity is, I cannot adequately express. The Duke bowed. I am pleased to be of service. As they prepared to depart, the Duke caught Eleanor's hand briefly. A touch so fleeting it might have been accidental, but his eyes held hers. I will call on Thursday, he said quietly, if that would be acceptable. Yes, Eleanor managed. That would be acceptable. The carriage ride home passed in near silence. Lord Harrington stared out the window, his mind clearly racing. Sophia held Eleanor's hand, squeezing gently. That evening, as Eleanor prepared for bed, she heard footsteps in the corridor outside her room. They paused at her door. She waited, holding her breath, but no knock came. After a long moment, the footsteps retreated. Lord Harrington had stood outside his younger daughter's door, the daughter he had overlooked and dismissed, the daughter who had accomplished what his perfect daughter could not. and found himself unable to speak, unable to apologize, unable to acknowledge, unable to reconcile the Eleanor he had always ignored with the Eleanor who had captured a duke's genuine affection. His reckoning was not yet complete. But in her room, Eleanor stood at the window, looking out at the star-scattered sky, and felt the weight of invisibility finally completely lifting. She was seen. She was chosen. She was free! And the terror of it was matched only by the exhilarating, breathtaking joy. Chapter 7. Society's Judgment. The news spread through London society like ink bleeding through paper, unstoppable, staining everything it touched. The Duke of Ravenswood is courting the younger Harrington sister. Not the beautiful one, the plain one. Eleanor first heard the whispers during a fitting at the Modiste, where Madame Laurent's assistants spoke in voices they thought were too low to carry. Imagine choosing her over Lady Sophia. Perhaps grief truly has damaged his faculties? She pretended not to hear, standing perfectly still while pins were adjusted, her face carefully blank, but each word was a needle, finding its mark. By the time Lady Pendleton's garden party arrived 3 days later, the gossip had reached a fever pitch. Eleanor had considered feigning illness to avoid attending, but Sophia had taken her hand that morning and said simply, "We face them together." So Eleanor dressed in a gown of soft blue, not gray this time, not invisible, and went to face society's judgment. The Pendleton estate gardens were magnificent in the autumn afternoon, all golden light and precisely manicured hedges. Ladies in their finest gowns clustered like exotic birds beneath silk canopies, while gentlemen stood in groups discussing politics and horses. Servants circulated with champagne and delicate pastries. It should have been beautiful. Instead, it felt like stepping into an arena. The whispers started the moment Eleanor and Sophia descended from their carriage. Not even whispers, really. Conversations held at volumes clearly meant to be overheard. The plain sister has snared him somehow. A woman in peacock blue said to her companion, her voice carrying across the lawn. Perhaps she used some art. Women have ways, you know. I heard the Duke's judgment must be impaired by grief. Another replied, 8 years of mourning would disorder anyone's mind. Eleanor felt each word like a physical blow, but she kept her chin high, her hand steady on Sophia's arm. They moved through the garden, accepting greetings that ranged from genuinely warm to coldly perfunctory, navigating a social battlefield where every smile might conceal a blade. Then, Lady Pendleton materialized before them. She was a formidable woman in her 60s, a society matriarch whose approval or disapproval could make or break a debutante's season. Her steel-gray gown matched her eyes, and her expression combined pity with something sharper. "Lady Eleanor," she said, her voice honey-sweet and venomous. "Might I have a word? It wasn't really a request." Sophia's hand tightened on Eleanor's arm, but Eleanor gently extracted herself and followed Lady Pendleton to a slightly more private corner of the garden. "My dear," Lady Pendleton began, her tone suggesting she was bestowing great wisdom, "I feel it is my duty to speak plainly to you. This attachment between yourself and the Duke, it is quite unfortunate." "Unfortunate?" Eleanor repeated, her voice carefully neutral. "You must know you are quite out of your depth," Lady Pendleton continued, her eyes cold despite her sympathetic expression. "The Duke requires a wife who can represent his position with grace and beauty, someone who can shine at state dinners, who can navigate the highest circles of society without embarrassment. Surely, you see, you are not suited to such a role." The words were delivered with surgical precision, designed to cut through whatever fragile confidence Eleanor had built. And they worked. Eleanor felt her carefully constructed composure cracking, felt the old familiar shame rising like a tide. "Lady Pendleton," she began, but her voice wavered. My sister, Sophia said, appearing at Eleanor's side like an avenging angel, possesses more grace in her smallest gesture than most women achieve in a lifetime. The Duke's judgment is impeccable. It is society's that I question. The pronouncement rang across the garden. Conversation stuttered to a halt. Heads turned. Lady Pendleton's expression froze in shock. Lady Sophia, surely you cannot. I can and I do, Sophia said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent her life as society's darling and no longer cared to maintain that position. My sister has been overlooked her entire life by people too shallow to see past surfaces. If the Duke is wise enough to recognize her worth, then he is a better judge of character than anyone present. She turned to Eleanor, whose eyes were swimming with tears. Come, the air here has grown stale. They walked away together, leaving Lady Pendleton speechless and society buzzing with this new development. But Eleanor made it only to the edge of the garden, to a secluded path lined with late blooming roses. Before she broke, I cannot do this, she gasped, pressing her hands to her face. Sophia, they are right. I am not beautiful enough, not polished enough. I will embarrass him. I will be a liability. He should choose someone else. Eleanor, the Duke's voice cut through her spiral. She looked up to find him standing a few feet away, his expression concerned, intense. Sophia, reading the situation with her usual acuity, melted away down the path, leaving them alone in the sheltering shade of the rose arbor. What has happened? The Duke asked, closing the distance between them. They are saying terrible things, Eleanor said, her voice breaking. That you are mad, that I have trapped you somehow, that I am completely unsuited to be your wife. Look at me, Eleanor. It was the first time he had used her given name. The intimacy of it made her breath catch. She met his eyes, dark, steady, certain. I have spent 8 years in a tomb of grief, he said, his voice low and fierce, surrounded by society's most beautiful women, feeling nothing but a distant sort of numbness. You brought me back to life. Do you think I care what Lady Pendleton thinks? But I care, Eleanor cried. I cannot bear to be the object of mockery, to have people whisper that you made a poor choice, that grief damaged your judgment. Then we will prove them wrong, the Duke said, stepping closer, his hands moving to grip her arms gently, steadying her together. But I need to know, Eleanor, are you rejecting me because of your own doubts or because of their judgment? The question cut to the heart of everything. Eleanor stared up at him, tears streaming down her face, and was forced to confront her deepest fear. Was she running because she genuinely believed she wasn't enough? Or because she had spent so long being told she wasn't enough, that she could no longer distinguish her own voice from society's? I am afraid, she whispered. I am afraid I will wake up and discover this was a dream. That I am still invisible, still overlooked, still the disappointing daughter who never quite measured up. I am afraid that one day you will look at me and see what everyone else sees, the plain one, the forgettable one, and wonder what you were thinking. The Duke's expression softened. One hand moved from her arm to cup her face, his thumb brushing away tears. You have never been invisible to me, he said. From the moment I saw you at that ball, reading Wollstonecraft, genuinely absorbed in ideas rather than performing for an audience, I saw you. I see you still. I see a woman of remarkable intelligence, fierce honesty, and a depth of character that makes every other woman I've met seem like shadows on a wall. They will never accept me, Eleanor said, but her voice was weakening. Some will, the Duke countered. Some already do, and those who don't, their opinions matter less to me than one honest conversation with you. He paused, his eyes searching hers. I do not want to be invisible anymore. I want to be seen by you, even if society disapproves. Then stand with me, the Duke said. Let them whisper. Let them judge. We will build something real, something that doesn't require their approval to exist. But I need you to choose this, Eleanor, not out of duty or desperation, but because you want it." Eleanor looked up at this man who saw her, truly saw her, who had offered her freedom and then stood firm when she was most afraid. She thought of 22 years of invisibility, of making herself small, of accepting that she was less than, and she chose differently. "I do not want to be invisible anymore," she said, her voice growing stronger. "I want to be seen by you, by myself. Even if society disapproves, even if they whisper, even if they never accept me, I want to try. I want this." The Duke smiled, that genuine smile that transformed his grief-marked face into something beautiful. "Then let us return to the party," he said, offering his arm. Together, Eleanor took his arm, feeling the solid warmth of him beside her, and they walked back down the rose-lined path toward the garden party and its judging eyes. The whispers rose like a wave when they appeared Eleanor's hand on the Duke's arm, his posture protective, both their expressions resolute. Lady Pendleton's face went through several fascinating transformations. Other guests stared openly, but Sophia was there smiling with fierce pride. And a few faces, the Duchess of Somerset, old Lord Hartfield, Lady Sarah Whitmore, showed not judgment, but approval. Eleanor held her head high and did not let go of the Duke's arm. That evening, as Eleanor prepared for bed, a soft knock sounded at her door. "Come in," she called, expecting Sophia. Instead, Lord Harrington entered, looking older and more uncertain than she had ever seen him. "Father?" Eleanor said, surprised. He stood in the doorway, struggling visibly with words that clearly didn't come easily. "I have failed you as a father," he said finally, his voice rough. "I saw only what society valued and missed what truly mattered. For 22 years, I looked past you, dismissed you, treated you as though you were somehow less than your sister. I cannot undo those years. I cannot give you back what I took through my blindness." Eleanor's throat tightened. "But I see you now," Lord Harrington continued. "And I am proud of your courage, proud of the woman you have become despite my failures. You have more strength than I ever recognized. It wasn't a complete redemption. Years of hurt couldn't be erased with one conversation. But it was a beginning, an acknowledgement, an apology, a tentative step toward something better." "Thank you, Father," Eleanor said softly. He nodded, unable to say more, and withdrew. Eleanor stood alone in her room, looking at her reflection in the mirror, the same face she had always had, unremarkable, ordinary, not the face society celebrated, but seen, chosen, valued. She smiled at her reflection, and finally, for the first time in her life, liked what she saw. Chapter 8. The Gala and the Declaration. 4 weeks had passed since the garden party, and Eleanor had spent them learning what it meant to be courted properly. There had been walks in the park, with Sophia accompanying as chaperone, where she and the Duke discussed everything from political philosophy to their favorite novels. Dinners at both estates where conversation flowed easily, despite Lord Harrington's lingering nervousness. Afternoons in the Duke's magnificent library, where he had given her free rein to explore his collection, and they had debated the merits of various authors until the light faded. She had grown more confident with each passing day, more certain that this was real, that she was genuinely wanted. But tonight was the ultimate test. The Duke's gala was the event of the season. Every person of consequence in London society would be there, watching, judging, waiting to see what the Duke would do. Eleanor stood before her mirror as Sophia fastened the last button on her gown, deep sapphire silk that they had chosen together, elegant and understated, honoring Eleanor's own style rather than trying to compete with conventional beauty. "You look magnificent," Sophia said, stepping back to admire her work. Not because of the gown, though it's lovely. Because you look like yourself. Confident, ready. Eleanor met her sister's eyes in the mirror. I'm terrified. Ahem. Good, Sophia said, smiling. That means it matters. A knock at the door interrupted them. Lord Harrington's voice, tentative. The carriage is ready when you are. In the month since his halting apology, her father had been carefully, awkwardly trying to repair what he had broken. He asked about her reading now. He looked at her when he spoke. It wasn't enough to erase 22 years, but it was something. We're coming, Father, Eleanor called. Sophia squeezed her hand. Tonight you step fully into the light, no more shadows. Eleanor took a deep breath and nodded. Ravenswood Hall blazed with light, every window golden, the drive lined with torches that turned the approaching carriages into a procession of fire. The sound of music and laughter drifted across the grounds, and Eleanor felt her heart hammering against her ribs. The weight of hundreds of eyes found her the moment she entered the ballroom. She had expected it, had prepared for it, but the reality still stole her breath. Society's elite turned to observe the Harrington family's entrance, conversations pausing mid-sentence, fans stilling mid-flutter. The whispers began immediately. Not cruel now, but curious, speculative. The Duke's choice, the plain sister, the one who somehow captured him. Then the Duke was there, crossing the ballroom with purpose, his eyes finding Eleanor immediately as though everyone else had ceased to exist. Lady Eleanor, he said, bowing formally. Lady Sophia, Lord Harrington, welcome. His greeting was proper, appropriate, but his gaze held Eleanor's a moment longer than strictly necessary, and she saw in his eyes everything he couldn't say in public. You're here? You came? You're magnificent. The evening progressed in a blur of introductions and conversations. Eleanor navigated the social waters with growing confidence, no longer trying to disappear into corners. Some guests remained cool, disapproving. Others were curious, asking thoughtful questions, genuinely interested in this woman who had captured the Duke's heart. A few were openly supportive. The Duchess of Somerset, ancient, formidable, respected by all, approached Eleanor during a lull in conversation. My dear, she said, her voice carrying the authority of 8 decades of navigating society. I have watched the Duke for 8 years. I knew his Victoria, wonderful girl, taken far too soon. I have watched him grieve, watched him withdraw, watched countless beautiful women try and fail to breach his defenses. Eleanor held her breath. You have given him back his life, the Duchess continued. Anyone who cannot see your value is a fool. I expect you to call on me next week. We have much to discuss. It was an endorsement, a public declaration of approval from one of society's most influential figures. Eleanor felt something tight in her chest loosen. Thank you, Your Grace, she managed. The Duchess patted her arm. Stand firm, child. You're stronger than you know. The moment came as the clock struck 10. The Duke crossed the ballroom, the crowd parting before him, and stopped in front of Eleanor. The music had paused between sets. The entire room fell silent. Lady Eleanor, he said, his voice carrying in the sudden quiet, would you do me the honor of this dance? It was the question everyone had been waiting for. Eleanor's hand trembled slightly as she placed it in his. Yes, she said clearly, I would be honored. The orchestra began a waltz, something sweeping and romantic that filled the ballroom with sound. But as the Duke led Eleanor onto the floor, as his hand settled at her waist and hers on his shoulder, the music faded to background noise. The world narrowed to just the two of them. They moved together, turning in perfect synchronization, and Eleanor forgot to be nervous, forgot the watching eyes, forgot everything except the man before her. I see you, Lady Eleanor, the Duke said quietly. His voice meant only for her. Not as the sister in the shadows, but as yourself. As the woman who challenged me, who made me want to live again, who brought light back into my carefully guarded heart. Eleanor felt tears threatening, but kept them at bay through sheer will. "I have spent my life invisible," she said, finding her voice, finding her courage. "But you taught me that I was not invisible. I was simply waiting to be seen by the right eyes." The Duke's expression softened, transformed. "Will you marry me, Eleanor?" he asked, the words carrying the weight of everything they had built together. "Will you stand beside me, not as an ornament, but as a partner? Will you challenge me, debate with me, build a life of substance with me?" The ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Eleanor looked up at this man who saw her, truly saw her, who had offered her not just love, but freedom, partnership, genuine equality. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and certain, no longer afraid. "I choose myself, and I choose you." The Duke smiled that genuine transformative smile and produced a ring from his pocket, simple, elegant, with a sapphire the exact color of her gown set in delicate gold. He slipped it onto her finger as they continued to dance, and the ballroom erupted. Applause thundered through the space, even from those who had disapproved, even from those who had whispered cruel things, because the Duke's happiness was undeniable. Eleanor's courage was evident, and love, when it was this real, was impossible to dismiss. They finished the dance as an engaged couple, and Eleanor felt like she was floating. Then, as the music ended, and they stepped apart, a commotion rippled through the crowd near the entrance. A man stood there, tall, sun-bronzed, dressed in traveling clothes that spoke of hasty arrival. His eyes swept the ballroom and locked immediately on one person, Sophia. Captain James Whittaker had come home. Eleanor watched her sister's face transform, every carefully maintained mask shattering to reveal pure, overwhelming joy. Sophia moved across the ballroom like a woman in a dream, and the captain met her halfway, taking her hands, saying something Eleanor couldn't hear, but could read in every line of his body. "I never stopped loving you." The Duke leaned close to Eleanor. "I tracked him down 3 weeks ago," he whispered, sent a letter explaining the situation. "He was already booking passage home when my letter arrived. He'd been planning to return for months, gathering the courage to win her back." Eleanor looked up at her fiancé with wonder. "You did this?" "Every love story deserves a chance," he said simply. Across the room, Lord Harrington watched both his daughters, one newly engaged to a duke, one reunited with her lost love, and Eleanor saw understanding finally dawn on his face, the cost of his blindness, the years wasted trying to force his daughters into shapes that didn't fit them, the happiness he had nearly destroyed through narrow vision. He met Eleanor's eyes across the ballroom and nodded. Not forgiveness earned, but acknowledgement given. The gala continued, but now 2 love stories were blooming amid the music and champagne and society's fascinated whispers. Later, when the crowd had thinned slightly and the initial excitement had settled, Eleanor and the Duke slipped away to the terrace. The autumn night was crisp and clear. Stars scattered across the sky like diamonds. The gardens stretched before them in geometric beauty, and the sounds of the gala drifted through the open doors behind them. Distant, unimportant. "I was so afraid," Eleanor said quietly, looking out over the grounds. "Afraid I wasn't enough. Afraid this was all a dream that would shatter." The Duke took her hand, his thumb brushing over the sapphire ring. "You were always enough. You simply needed to believe it yourself." Eleanor turned to face him. This man who had seen her when she was invisible, who had valued her mind as much as any other quality, who had offered her partnership instead of ownership. "I believe it now," she said. Finally, they stood together in the starlight, hand in hand, the future stretching before them like an unwritten book. Inside, Sophia danced with her captain. Lord Harrington wrestled with his conscience, and society revised its opinions with the fickleness of those who follow rather than lead. But out here, in the quiet darkness, Eleanor Harrington, soon to be Eleanor Beaumont, Duchess of Ravenswood, stood in the light at last, no longer invisible, no longer afraid, finally, beautifully, completely herself. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. And so, dear listeners, Eleanor Harrington stepped out of the shadows and into a love that saw her true worth. Sometimes the greatest love stories aren't about being chosen despite our flaws. They're about being cherished because of our authentic selves. If this story touched your heart, please show your support by hitting that like button. It helps more people discover these tales of hope and unexpected romance. Subscribe to Lyra's Romance Stories and ring the notification bell so you never miss our next journey into love, courage, and happy endings. What did you think of Eleanor and the Duke's story? Have you ever felt invisible only to be truly seen by someone special? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and I love hearing how these stories resonate with you. And if you're craving more historical romance with strong heroines who refuse to be defined by society's expectations, check out the story in the card above. You'll love it. Until our next story, remember, you are not invisible. You are simply waiting to be seen by the right eyes, and when that moment comes, have the courage to step into the light. This is Lyra reminding you that true love sees the soul, not just the surface. Sweet dreams, and I'll see you in the next story.